Okay, here to dig into what we heard at this committee. Stephanie Carvin is an associate professor at Carleton University's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. Professor Carvin specializes in issues of intelligence and national security. Artur Wilczynski is a former assistant deputy minister at the Communications Security Establishment. He's now a senior fellow at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. I want to thank you both for joining me today. Stephanie Carvin, I'd like to start with you if I can, and what we heard from Public Safety Deputy Minister Sean Tupper today, that the RCMP is not pursuing criminal investigations into the alleged foreign interference attempts in 2019 or in 2021. Were you surprised to hear that?
No, perhaps for two reasons. The first one is that, I think some of us have been saying for a long time, intelligence is not evidence. And we heard that at the committee today, right? Intelligence is reporting on what you're hearing in the community, and it's assessed as a broader or a small piece of information within a broader investigation, right? And, some of the concerns being raised, I think, about, we're seeing just pieces and not the full picture, are maybe distorting some of the reporting that we're actually seeing. So that's fair. But the second thing, and this didn't come up as much, maybe a little bit there at the end, one of the big concerns I have is that it's actually very hard to take intelligence and turn it into evidence that you would use in some kind of prosecution. This is an issue we have been struggling with really since the 1980s, right? That it's become very, very hard for intelligence agencies to provide any kind of information to law enforcement because you compromise your sources and methods. And it's something that Canada and successive Canadian governments have not wanted to fix. And so it may just be very well that that information may not have been passed on to the RCMP, who then would not have started an investigation.
So, Artur Wilczynski, then, if, say, Liberals may look at this and say, look, there's no criminal investigations going on, despite the headlines we've seen from Global and the Globe and Mail over the last couple of weeks, we're good. They shouldn't necessarily come to that conclusion, or how should they interpret it?
Well, look, I think the bottom line is that foreign interference in Canadian elections and in Canadian domestic policy and various issues is a profound problem, and we need to address it. But the question is, how do we make sure that we have the right tools in order to address it? And what do we need as institutions, from a policy perspective, from an authority's point of view, to make sure that we have eyes on and that we can take measures to mitigate the risks to Canadian elections? I just wanted to pick up on one of the things that Stephanie mentioned in terms of the effects of the disclosures, in terms of the intelligence to evidence. There's actually consequence there. When there is a public disclosure around potential intelligence, that also has the potential effect of negatively impacting police forces and their ability to pursue a case, because things have been put into the public domain that maybe should have remained protected so that police could do their job in parallel to that of the intelligence services.
So whoever is doing this, and you assume a noble motivation here is a concerned whistleblower, based on your analysis, this could actually be undermining maybe the outcome they're seeking to achieve?
Again, assuming those kinds of noble objectives, even if that was the case, the effect of the disclosures, I think, has been to do two things. One, it has put in jeopardy potential investigations that are important, that need to be pursued using techniques and sources that need to remain protected. It could negatively affect that. But also, more broadly, I think it has, as an effect, undermined Canadians' confidence in the integrity of our elections. And as a strategic outcome, I think that is profoundly problematic, because democracies are under threat around the world. We in Canada need to make sure that the way that we behave, and in particular the way our security and intelligence agencies behave, is one that upholds the law, which at the end of the day is the fundamental basis of democracy, is the rule of law.
So, Stephanie Carvin, Jody Thomas, who's the National Security and Intelligence Advisor to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, she was one of the first to testify today. She said these leaks of intelligence endanger national security and the people who are subject to those national security investigations. How unprecedented is it that an individual or multiple individuals privy to this kind of information is leaking it to the media?
It's very rare that we have these kinds of leaks in Canada. This really is an unprecedented situation. It is hard to assess the motivation of this person. It may be noble, it may not be noble, and that's something to take into consideration when we do see this information. But in my experience, CSIS doesn't leak that much, right? But this also raises the other question that it's not necessarily CSIS that is leaking this information, or someone within the CSIS. It could be anyone who would have access to this reporting. So it could be someone in the Privy Council office, for example, someone potentially in small sections of the RCMP, or in other parts of government. So we actually don't know who is leaking this information, or how much of it has leaked. I strongly suspect that there are going to be more stories. This is not going to be going away, and so it's something that to keep in mind.
So given we don't know the motivation, we don't know the source, Artur, but it is a violation of national law. I mean, this is a criminal act to leak this information. I mean, what kind of alarm bells do you think are going off inside CSIS and the national security apparatus because of this?
Well, I think significant ones. I think the disclosure, the illegal disclosure of classified information is a fundamental problem. I think as somebody who's been a national security and intelligence practitioner for a number of years, one of the things that's absolutely drilled into us is the importance of preserving classified information. It is classified for a reason. The reason it is kept that way is because of the potential harm of disclosure. And so for us, it's a violation of our fundamental ethics when that's broken. And again, it undermines our effectiveness in actually achieving the outcomes that we need for Canadians, which is having insight and access to information that we can then provide to policymakers to put in place policies that mitigate risks to our national security.
So Stephanie Carvin, the opposition are pretty much unanimous now wanting a public inquiry into this. And we heard from Jody Thomas also today that a public inquiry would have the same limitations that the committee is faced with, that national security and redactions and lack of access to information would hamper any ability to get answers. Is she right there? I mean, can the public conceivably learn something new here from a public inquiry, or is it just not the right venue to deal with this?
Yeah, can I just first address something Artur said? Because I want to radically agree with what he said. But I also want to point out that the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency, one of our institutions that is supposed to provide transparency, has raised on numerous occasions, there's basically no whistleblowing mechanism for national security agencies in this country, right? If we want to control, if we want to have some kind of release valve for people to raise issues, we need to do that. I mean, the Security of Information Act has some provisions for, the benefit of Canada, but it actually excludes national security from those kinds of exclusions, right? So we have no whistleblowing protections and this is maybe something the Trudeau government was going to have to look at, because maybe this person could have found other ways to have raised these issues. So that's a separate, that's not your question. But I feel that's an important thing to raise here, is that there is actually no whistleblowing mechanism for people in CSIS to raise these concerns. The question about the like a public inquiry, I support it. I've publicly said, at least on Twitter, that I support it. Simply, I don't think it has to be like a one-stop shop. One of the main differences we have now than 10 years ago, and something the Prime Minister pointed out, is we do actually have a lot of institutions now that can do both classified and unclassified reviews, right? So we could take like a multi-agency approach to looking at this problem and actually coordinate it better. The National Security Intelligence Review Agency could look at propriety. NSI COP could definitely look at some of the documents. We could have, something that kind of bothers me in all of this is that, people in the Chinese community have been saying this for years. I was at a conference earlier this week where someone from the Chinese community said, this doesn't surprise any of us. We have been speaking out about this and no one has listened. So maybe it's time we have, a public commission that actually talks to people or communities that have experienced this, as the Prime Minister said, that it's the Asian community that experiences this more than any other community, and he's right. So I think we could definitely do something public, but we could also do look at the instruments, the toolkits that we have, put something together, and take a wide approach to solving this problem.
Artur Wilczynski, I have a question just about the ability to talk about this. And this is something that the Prime Minister and his staff have complained about, that they're being asked very specific questions and they're not giving very specific answers. And they say that is because they are constrained by the limits of national security law. How constrained are they? Is this a legitimate explanation from the Prime Minister's office that they just can't answer these questions, or is it political self-interest?
No, I actually think that there are very strict parameters for those who have access to intelligence, that they have obligations once they become sworn in to be able to receive classified information. They have an obligation to protect it. And if information is classified, whether or not it's been disclosed inappropriately or not, responding to questions about those disclosures in any kind of specific way has the potential of validating the information, so that there is real limitation in what the Prime Minister and other officials can say. That's why in front of the committee, members of the national security community were refusing to confirm the specificity of any of those disclosures. So I think we need to be mindful of that, and I think that it will affect any kind of review of what's transpired and what's been in the public domain. But I'll agree with Stephanie. I do think that there needs some kind of public examination of the issue. I think that the examination needs to be separate from this retrospective review of what may have happened. That absolutely falls within the remit of the National Security Intelligence Review Agency and the National Security Committee of Parliamentarians. That they can look at and handle all the classified information.
Right.
But what I think is missing is that broad policy question: is do we have the right tools moving forward? We have heard from people before the committee today that the threat is evolving. We need to stop looking backwards and trying to protect ourselves from the threat that happened 5 years ago.
The next election,
and look
the
at
problem.
the next election,
Right.
and also look at other levels of government. It's not just a federal issue; it's something that transcends, I think, the political context in Canada.
Right, it happens at the provincial level, municipal level, all kinds of levels.
Hostile foreign actors are sophisticated organizations. They know how our system works. If they want to affect it, they're going to look at what are the right mechanisms for them to do that. And that will not just be limited to what happens at the federal level during the writ period.
So Stephanie Carvin, this is perhaps a little bit more of a political question, but the partisanship and politics have intersected this one in a way that we just can't completely untangle it. But going back to this question of the Prime Minister has been asked about this day after day after day after day, and they keep going back to what we just discussed with Artur about the limits of what he can say. How tight are those guardrails? I mean, simply denying an allegation, I guess, maybe confirms other parts of what's out there, and that even becomes a trap for them. Like, how restricted are they in their ability to communicate freely on these issues with the Canadian public?
Yeah, I mean, I don't envy anyone who's testifying right now because, they don't want to speak to leaked reports. But at the same time, when they don't speak to them, they seem to kind of almost be confirming that they're true, right? And this is actually why I do think some kind of inquiry is necessitated because of that exact limitation that you just talked about, right? So at the same time, I do think we are a little stingy with how closely guarded, how much information that we classify, right? Like there's a lot of open source, there's a lot of other things that we can be using. And I think that, information could probably be declassified in a safe manner through the various institutions that we have. I mean, the problem is it's just, the questions are right now and these processes do take some time. But, questions about when did you meet with the Prime Minister to discuss these issues? I mean, people testifying should have those answers in front of them. They should have probably anticipated those answers. And those answers should be made public. And I think, maybe not the specific details on what's going out, but like when people were briefed.
Okay, but let me just ask you a question. Let me just ask you a question on that. And I'm sorry to interrupt you because, one of the reports from Global, Stephanie, is that the Prime Minister or the senior members of the Liberal Party were briefed about concerns about Han Dong, the now MP for Don Valley. They won't even confirm or deny that briefing happened. So telling us a date, are they even trapped and restricted from being able to say that yes, we were briefed on this specific issue, because that then confirms something that was released improperly? Like, does it go to that level of restriction in terms of disclosure?
I don't see. I mean, there's a difference between, saying like it's kind of almost like the metadata of the conversation, right? Like, did a conversation take place? Like, when were the various political parties briefed about these issues? Maybe that information could be released in its entirety. And again, there's a lot of uncertainty about who was even briefed, whether it was PMO, whether it was Liberal staffers, or who actually it was. I actually think that. this information could be made transparent if it's there. I mean, and I guess this is the huge challenge, is like, this stuff is out there now. Canadians have questions, and when we say, when officials go out and say, oh, don't worry, I'm not going to talk about this, but don't worry, we have all the tools we need, we're doing lots of stuff, I don't think that's good enough anymore, right? I think we need to treat Canadians with a certain level of sophistication, because only if Canadians are going to take it seriously, because they see our leaders taking it seriously, can we actually start doing something about this threat.
So as usual, I'm in violent agreement with Stephanie. Though a couple of points.
One, you're good 1-2 punch.
I think that the disclosures that name specific individuals have very negative effects on the persons that are named. They haven't had the benefit of the doubt. There has not been a burden of proof on the state as it exists in criminal procedures. It is just something that is now out there in the ether that has already caused damage. And I think this is one of the reasons why we need to protect information, because of that damage to individuals, because we have processes in place in order to mitigate that and to bring people before a court of law. So I think that I really feel for individuals whose names appear in these kinds of disclosures. But to go to the earlier point that Stephanie talked about, I do think the government has a lot of work to do on transparency. Transparency in terms of national security is absolutely essential, because for Canadians to have informed discussions about what the national security community does in their name, they need to be informed. And one of the things that has been profoundly troubling to me as a practitioner in this entire debate is how little Canadians know about what we actually do, how we do it, why we do it, under whose authority. And I think that this kind of crisis atmosphere around these disclosures is negatively affecting our ability to have a mature conversation about that. And that's why I go back to, I think it's important that we have some kind of process that explains what is the role of the national security community in protecting our democratic institutions, but also what are the roles of other actors? What is the role of Elections Canada? What is the role and obligations of political parties? What happens in nomination battles? How do we make sure that we have the right tools to address the evolving threat for, like you said, the next election, and not constantly look back at what happened in the U.S. in 2016 or other places, because the opponents of democracy, malevolent actors, are evolving their techniques in order to look forward and try and achieve outcomes in their interest, not ours.
So Stephanie Carvin, I want to go back to a point you raised at the very beginning of this conversation, and about the lack of criminal investigation and the challenge of distinguishing between intelligence versus evidence. The national security community is going to understand that. Law enforcement is going to understand that. We're now reading and hearing reports that is based on intelligence rather than evidence. So for Canadians reading about this, and this is in no way denigrating the reporting of my colleagues, I am in no way trying to do that, but how do we interpret that, and what should people bear in mind as they're reading stories and hearing political arguments that are based around intelligence reports that have been leaked, rather than, say, criminal evidence in a criminal court?
Right. So, I mean, at its core, intelligence is effectively reporting that you collect either through human intelligence sources or often technical sources like a wiretap, or what's called signals intelligence, which is kind of collected electronic information through, to use the formal term, global information infrastructure, right? So emails, text messages, that kind of thing. And so the issue is that it can give you a picture of what's going on, but sources don't always give you the 100% truth, right? And that's something we have to keep in mind. Sources are humans. They can get things wrong. They can report rumors. They can yeah, exactly. They can lie, for these kinds of things. People who are being wiretapped may know that they're being wiretapped, so they could say things they just try and deliberately mislead people. So, I mean, I was on Twitter the other day. I was trying to compare it to, like, your friend Jim, who goes on a holiday and talks about all the fabulous things that he did on holiday. Like, he caught a 50-pound fish, and he dated a model, and he won a limbo contest and all these things. And Jim, and sure, like, Jim has a bad back. He probably didn't win the limbo contest. He almost certainly went on vacation.
Right.
You know that. But like the other parts of the story, you're going to want to corroborate and things like this. So we don't know what kinds of reports are out there. We don't know if these are single source reports or if they're based on multiple corroborated sources. We also don't know if, there's contradictory reports that are out there. Is this raw reporting or is this assessed product? So this is the, I guess, the trouble I have is that, we're getting the information that's in these reports, but the information isn't evidence. It may not be 100% true, and we should read them with a critical eye, even if they are pointing to what I think is kind of important here, which is the fact that there is this big foreign interference problem in Canada that we do need to deal with.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. I really appreciate your time, and I could keep this conversation going for a couple hours, but the show's only 2 hours long, and the committee is back, and we got to dip into that. But I want to thank you very much, Stephanie Carvin, Artur Wilczynski. That was great insight. We really appreciate it. Opposition parties are demanding a public inquiry into alleged Chinese meddling in Canadian elections. But today, the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor poured some cold water on that idea.
A public inquiry will have the same limitations that this committee does, in that we cannot talk about national security information in a public forum. The National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians was created for situations like this, where we can be absolutely transparent with them, and they can see the secret, top secret, protected information that was used to make decisions and to inform decision makers.
My next guest is also calling for a public inquiry. Richard Fadden is a former National Security Advisor and a former Director of the Canadian Security Intelligence Agency, and he joins me now. Mr. Fadden, thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you.
I'm wondering, sir, what do you make of Jody Thomas, the National Security Advisor's remarks today about the limitations of a public inquiry?
Well, the necessity of protecting classified information is going to be a problem no matter what we do, be it NSCOP, a public inquiry, or a regular parliamentary committee. I think we're underestimating the capacity of Canadians to understand the need to protect certain national security secrets. I would argue that given the political sensitivity of this subject and the substantive sensitivity of this subject, the Chinese interference, that we're better off with a public inquiry with a very respected commissioner, be it a Supreme Court justice or another justice, who would bring credibility to the review that politicians will not. You don't have to take my word for it. You can just look at the rating of people, the professions that people respect. Politicians are not at the top. But in particular, in this case, I think it's unfair to ask them to look at this. And as well-functioning as NSCOP may be, I don't think it's going to work this time. So I would say, create a public inquiry, empower the commissioner or commissioners and it's his or her staff to take classified information, have the commissioner in his report explain carefully what he or has seen, but not reveal necessarily it, and then draw his conclusions. I think otherwise we're not going to get a full and fair explanation of what's going on.
The NSICOP, the National Security Committee of Parliamentarians, why do you think that won't work? Is it simply because they've got too much skin in the game? It's elections, they're partisan, they're politicians, and that's why? Or is it, as you mentioned, the public trust level in politicians that seems to be the challenge there?
I think NSCOP is doing a pretty good job at its work, but I think it is populated by politicians. As one of your earlier panelists said, it's already been boycotted by one political party because of a disagreement some time ago. So it seems to me that we're better off if we take this out of politics. Eventually, it will go back into politics because whatever recommendations are made are going to have to go back to the government and Parliament. But to get to that point, I think we're better off taking it out of politics entirely and entrust it to a judge or former judge whose credibility and whose impartiality cannot be questioned.
So we have this situation, though, where we had the report released yesterday. And I know it was written by Mr. Rosenberg, and that has been made an issue by the Conservatives, but the conclusions came from the national security agencies. It came from the top civil servants in the land who were appointed to be on this oversight committee. And they've given their conclusion that the election held and the election has integrity. How would that be any different than what a public inquiry commissioner could go with? Because people seem to be reluctant to believe the word of this committee that oversaw the election.
Well, a couple of things. I think the mandate of the committee was relatively limited, and your earlier panelists have talked about that. Mr. Rosenberg's review was limited to the mandate that the committee had initially. I think that asking deputy ministers to decide when they're going to interfere with an election is almost unfair. That group of 4 or 5 deputy ministers basically have to decide, in the context of that committee, whether or not to push a button and warn people that our elections were at a risk. It's almost a religion within the public service that you do everything conceivable to avoid affecting an election. So I would say, that's fine. It was a useful device, but let's move on. We've I think, become convinced, or certainly I have, I shouldn't generalize, that the threat of foreign interference is increasing. It's not diminishing. The other thing I think it's important to remember is that the mandate of that committee was to look at whether or not the elections writ large were fair and open.
Right.
That does not address the issue at the individual constituency level, where people's votes are as important as anybody else. And I think we're being a bit too cute when we say that the issue is resolved when the election is fair and open, because under our system of government, the prime minister is the government, not because he wins an election directly, but because he has a number of people who've won in individual constituencies. And to the extent that that foreign interference has an impact on those elections at the county level, at the constituency level, it impacts our entire system. Right. And I don't think, to be honest, that NSCOP is particularly well equipped to look at that kind of issue. They're equipped to look at national security and the foreign interference. I think a public inquiry should also look at how the Canada Elections Act is functioning. Is the Commissioner of Elections doing as much he or she could? Is the RCMP playing a reasonable role? Some of these issues go beyond national security, even relatively broadly defined.
Right.
Whereas I think if you have a public inquiry with a broad mandate and broad powers, you may have a reasonable chance of getting at some of the issues that you and others have raised.
A public safety official confirmed today that the RCMP is not pursuing any criminal investigations into alleged foreign interference in the 2019 or 2021 elections, despite the headlines we've seen the last couple of weeks. You surprised by that? Should Canadians be surprised by that, the lack of criminal investigation here by the National Police Force?
Yes and no. I think one of the things that we need to talk about is that the level of assurance required, the level of proof required, the entry level into inquiries by CSIS is quite a bit lower than that's required by the law enforcement agencies. So I accept entirely that CSIS was investigating all sorts of possible foreign interference that may not transpose to a level that the police would consider necessary to investigate formally and to prosecute. Having said that, if everything that was written by your colleagues in the media is taken as accurate, I'm a little bit surprised that there's not something there. I also wonder whether the Commissioner of Elections wouldn't have had a somewhat greater role. Mm-hmm. But having said all of this, whatever you and I think, whatever the evidence is, there's a perception problem here that I think is growing, and it's growing at a fair rate of knots. And we have to find some way, I think, to reassure people. The Mounties if the Deputy Minister is accurate, the Mounties have decided not to investigate. Was that decision taken at a senior level, at an intermediate level? Is it subject to review now that everything is coming out? I don't know, but somebody somewhere should look at all this globally and make some recommendations for the future, because as I said a moment ago, I think this is going to get worse before it gets better. It's certainly the case in other countries. And as one of the people appearing before Proc this afternoon says, it's not just China, it's Russia and conceivably some other countries. So we need to take this seriously by taking some action.
But we take the action of trying to strengthen our institutions, maybe do some counterintelligence. If there's no criminal consequence for people who are messing with the elections and no diplomatic consequences, no one's been declared persona non grata, despite bragging apparently about people who work in consulates of meddling in the elections. If there's no obvious consequence for the people who are deemed to be the meddlers, how do you stop the meddling?
Well, you can't blame the Prime Minister or the government if the RCMP are not prosecuting. I mean, police independence is very important. You can ask the government, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Public Safety, and the Prime Minister why somebody wasn't declared persona non grata. I mean, one of the things that I think we're not doing as much as we should, if I may, is we're looking at foreign interference. This is an important issue. It has to be dealt with. But the government is also charged with looking at our relations with China more broadly. We have diplomatic, defense, trade, finance, humanitarian relations. Any one of these could be used as levers to make the point that we're very unhappy. And the government has chosen not to do this for their own reasons. But I tend to agree with you. When a consular official brags to have interfered in the election, assuming that evidence is fairly clear, I don't understand why they were not declared persona non grata.
Okay, Richard Fadden, we appreciate your time and your insight. That's Richard Fadden, the former director of CSIS. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.